The next section in the video is about presentation skills. This is another one of those soft skills of an architect that may not seem like part of the job description when you first get into this space, but turns out is a pretty important part of the job description, because one of the things you're going to have to do is articulate your ideas to other people, and you will probably end up using the lingua franca of the enterprise, which is a tool like PowerPoint or Keynote. That's what this talk is about, is how to effectively use those two tools. Most of this material is based on a book that I wrote a couple of years ago with two other guys, Matthew McCullough and Nate Schuda, called Presentation Patterns. And so what I'm going to talk about in this section are some highlights from presentation patterns that apply specifically to roles like architecture. And I'm going to talk about the three sections of the book, which is about preparing a talk, building the talk, and then finally delivering the talk. One of our main realizations when we wrote the Presentation Patterns book is what's the real difference between a presentation versus prose? If you need to convey an idea to someone, what medium should you use to convey that idea? Should you write in a word processor or desktop publishing software, or should you write it in a tool like Keynote or PowerPoint? What is the fundamental difference between those tools? And the main difference is time. It turns out that this distinction about time is really important, because as you deliver material, you can time it so that it has better impact. Another aspect of presentations that is beyond what you would get in a traditional word processor desktop publishing software is creativity. Now, my wife and I are pretty creative people, we think, and every year we throw an insanely elaborate Halloween party. This is our bedroom. This is the spider bedroom. I actually sleep under this for several months a year. We have spiders on the ceiling in our bedroom. This is our hallway. I'm the proud owner of a couple of hundred rubber bats, which we hang from our foyer. And you can see fake wallpaper that my wife puts up. She starts decorating months in advance for this thing. Here's a picture of my wife and I as mummies when the theme of our Halloween party was mummies. We always have a costume theme and a prize for the best costume. And we really value creativity. Here is my friend David Bach, and the theme that year was pirates. And he came as a software pirate. And this is me the year that, me and my wife, the year that we had a pirate theme. So as you can tell, we put a lot of effort into this. If you think this is embarrassing, seeing a picture of me like this in a Halloween costume, here's something that's really embarrassing. One of my very early technical presentations. This has now what I would call a huge number of anti-patterns in it, of things that you should not do in technical presentations. In fact, the idea of the Presentation Patterns book is we've taken the Gang of Four idea of design patterns and anti-patterns and applied them to doing technical presentations. That's the idea of presentation patterns. And these are all anti-patterns. What we call a bullet-riddled corpse, which is just a slide with nothing but bullet points on it. A broken outline, which is an outline that only has a single heading and then multiple entries. That really should be the whole slide. It's just the points that are inside that outline. And also what we call flood marks, which are things that are on every single slide that are not adding to the information you're trying to convey. They're just kind of furniture that's in your way. And the stupid thing about flood marks is, let's say I wanted to put a full screen picture here. Well, do I cover up the flood marks and hide the little logos, or does it stick out from behind? This is just useless information on a slide. So that is what my slides look like for a long time, but then I improved. I upgraded to Keynote, and this is what one of my circa 2007 presentations looked like. I had improved the background and noticed that I had implemented the state-of-the-art 3D bullets on my presentation. And I delivered this at several conferences, and I got a feedback form from one of the conferences who said, the material was really good, but it was a very old-fashioned presentation style. And I said, old-fashioned? Did you notice the 3D bullets that I used on the slide? But of course I realized because of that, he was correct. I was using the tool in a really, really silly way, and in fact this implemented a ton of these kind of anti-patterns that we bumped into. So as I mentioned, the idea of the Presentation Patterns book was there are a lot of interesting books about presentations out. Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds is a fantastic book about the philosophy of doing presentations, but it's not very practical. Slideology is probably too practical because they get into things like color palettes and how to find fonts and all that stuff, which is way too low level for most people. What we really want is a concrete guide for if you're building this kind of presentation, then this is the kind of thing you should do. So we're all three of us are software professionals, so we're all geeks at heart, so we love the concept of design patterns and try to apply it to something like technical presentations. I had this idea as just kind of a seed of an idea, but then I started noticing at every presentation I saw, I was starting to categorize things as patterns and anti-patterns. And we didn't do recipes, which is probably a more intuitive thing to most of the non-technical world, because recipes are at the wrong level of abstraction. Because if you look at a recipe, it has instruction words in it like saute and things that are judgment calls like firm to the bite. That's the thing that we're really trying to build with presentation patterns. So our presentation patterns book is not about I need to build a technical presentation and here's a template for it. It's the very low level things that actually go into making up a recipe. And of course the other thing that we really wanted from the patterns world was the concept of anti-patterns, because so many of the tools in this space like PowerPoint or Keynote encourage you to do really, really bad things from an information exposition standpoint, and so we wanted to call those things out as things you should specifically avoid. And this is a good example of some of the things that I was talking about avoiding. Here's an example of an anti-pattern, this bullet-riddled corpse anti-pattern that I talked about before. Here's an example of a newer deck that I created after the one that I showed you before, and this also has a lot of bad anti-patterns like flood marks, including some user-created flood marks. The conference I was speaking at insisted on a bunch of flood marks, so I added my own and overlaid some of theirs, but that's never a battle you're going to win. Here's another example of an anti-pattern. You see a lot of slides in organizations like this. This is where you're using PowerPoint or Keynote as a word processor rather than as a presentation tool. You would never want to present this onto a wall somewhere because it's way too much information. There are way too many things on here. And it implements a huge number of our anti-patterns, including those flood marks. So it's okay for the first and last slides if you want branding and other kinds of chromy elements on your slides. But get rid of them for most of your slides, because all that stuff is just adding to the cognitive load of the slide, but it's not actually conveying any useful information on the slide. So one of the distinctions we make in the Presentation Patterns book is between an info deck versus a presentation. These are both built in a tool like Keynote or PowerPoint. But an info deck is one that is emailed around and meant to be flipped through at someone's leisure, more like a document, versus a presentation, which is meant to be shown on a wall somewhere. And there are two main distinguishing factors between info decks versus presentations, and that is the presence of animations and transitions. If you're just sending a PowerPoint deck around for people to flip through, you won't take any time to build animations or transitions, whereas if you're doing a proper presentation, you will. And of course, animations here are movement and revelation within a slide, so what you just saw was an animation. A transition is a move between slides, and all the tools give you different animations and different transitions for different cases, and so you're just about to see a transition now. This is a good example of taking this concept and pushing it into kind of an unusual place. Martin Fowler has taken this info deck idea and created blog entries. He has a category of blog entries on his site called infodecks. And infodecks are written in web technologies, and they look kind of like presentations, but they are in fact designed for a person to flip through them and get exposition at whatever rate they want. So the layout looks very much like slides, but as you click through it, you will actually see the exposition rate that is controlled by you. This is a good example of something that is designed, notice very small fonts, designed to be read almost like a desktop publishing piece, but it still has the unit of work of slides. So those are a bunch of general things about presentations. Let's talk about some specific sections from the book, and the first one is about preparing your talks. And the first one of these is something that I highlighted in the section about writing, and that is know who your audience is. This is a really important thing for doing presentations. You want to make sure that you get the right audience because you don't want to bore an audience by giving them too much information or information that's too low a level. You also don't want to go over their head. This can be really tricky sometimes when you have a mixed audience and you're not sure exactly who's going to be there. And so one of the patterns I'll talk about in just a second is this idea of expansion joints. Put extra slides in your presentation in case you need to delve into more details about one part of it, and mostly plan to skip those slides but have them available in case you need to go into that because of some specialized members of your audience. The other thing that we also believe very firmly is that presentations, just like good writing, should have a narrative arc. You should introduce some things, you should explain the motivation for why you're doing this talk, you should give whatever your results are, and then resolve the story. This is the classic kind of narrative arc from fiction. And mostly you don't think of applying something like narrative arc to a presentation, but ultimately, presentations are storytelling, and if you tell a good story, you will get more compelling results. We've been listening to stories since we were little children. Everyone kind of intuitively understands narrative arc, and so if you build that into your presentation, you're going to get a better response from your audience. And so doing a technical kind of narrative arc is a little different than the traditional kind of, the Henry Miller famous description of narrative arc is introduce the protagonist, put him up in a tree, throw some rocks at him, and get him back down out of the tree. But we don't really have protagonists that we're throwing at trees, but we are often presenting problems and solutions and potential solutions. And so narrative arcs for technical presentations tend to look like this, where you present a problem and a potential solution and maybe some nuances of that solution, maybe multiple paths that we can think about toward that solution. So this is a very common narrative arc for a technical presentation. And in fact, I took one of my technical presentations and overlaid the sections on top of it as to exactly how this corresponds to the narrative arc that I built for this presentation. This is a presentation about doing test-driven design, and I bring up problem resolution, and it has a nice kind of conversational flow throughout the entire talk, and people are used to seeing things that have that familiar shape to them. Another thing that's a good idea for all of your decks is a unifying visual theme. And this can be something very, very subtle, or it can be something completely over the top, like Halloween pictures. We give a really elaborate prize every year. It's usually like an iPad for the best costume, so we get a lot of really good costumes. This is our prize winner one year. She came as Tippi Hedren in The Birds. This is a hand-built cardboard phone booth that has a hand-built telephone in it, and she attached birds to it with strings so that they were constantly attacking the phone booth, and she walked around the entire night in this costume and won the best costume prize. Here's another year, the same woman who won the prize again. This is our pirate party, and so she came as buried treasure, and you'll notice the strategically placed straw so that she can still consume alcoholic beverages at the party, even in this elaborate costume. This is a winner one year who came as Dead Paula Deen, who's a very famous Southern chef who likes to cook fried food, and so allegedly this was a bacon grease and donut based fire. She built the little coffin and wore it around the entire night as she was walking around, so that was enough to get her the prize. So all of my talks end up having a visual theme of some kind or another to some degree of overtness or not. So for example, I have a talk about functional thinking. The entire visual theme are blackboards because it's very mathematical. I have a metaprogramming Ruby talk where it's all screenshots from the movie Matrix because in the Matrix, Neo is metaprogramming the universe. My Agile Engineering Practices video and talk is all about engineered things like bridges. I did a talk called Design Patterns in Dynamic Languages and used fractals for all the visual theme for that because it's very mathematical, but it's also pattern-based as well. Putting a unifying visual theme on your talk gives it a nice consistency throughout the talk, and you don't have to go as overt as having full-screen Halloween pictures, but having common visual elements there makes it feel like a much more composed deck. There are some anti-patterns you need to avoid. One of them is an anti-pattern we refer to as an alienating artifact. This is any kind of statement or joke that you make at the expense of some portion of your audience. So one of the things that you want to do as you're doing presentations is get your audience to laugh and react to you. And one surefire way to get your audience to laugh or react is to tell a tasteless joke or make a sexist remark or something like that. The problem with that, though, is while you may get 80 or 90% of the audience to really appreciate that, you're going to annoy and alienate some portion of your audience. It's not worth it. No matter how good the joke is, you don't want to throw away part of your audience just because you have a really good joke. So don't put inappropriate humor, don't put sexism, don't put titillating pictures in presentations, because you're going to end up alienating someone and you're never going to get your message across to them if you've alienated them. Another thing is you're creating a talk is this kind of contrived word that we came up with, which is forethought. There are 4 steps that you should go through when you're creating a brand new presentation. The first of these is come up with the ideas for it. And I mentioned a little bit of this ideation when I talked about writing skills. I'm a big fan of using tools like mind maps, very unstructured kinds of tools to do the initial gathering of information and then gradually structure it as time goes by. So first you need to come up with the ideas for that talk, capture all those ideas in something like an outline or a mind map or some sort of magic bucket database tool like Evernote or DevonThink or something like that. Then organize your thoughts very frequently in an outline for me before you get into the presentation tool, and only then do you go into the design of the physical slides in the presentation tool. This is a really critical thing. Don't go to the presentation tool too early, because you'll start fiddling around with the visual design of the slides and you'll end up not having a good organized set of thoughts before you start worrying about visual stuff. Presentations have 2 modes of operation. They have the information exposition and they have the visual design. When you're trying to do both at the same time, you're not putting as much effort as you could if you separate those 2 things together. So I'm a big fan of actually outlining what it's going to say and then translating that outline into the actual tool. This is a pattern that I referenced before that we call expansion joints. This is really useful when you're going into an audience where it's a mixed audience, you're not sure who's going to be there, and you need to give some more context for some of your slides than others. All presentation tools allow you to have slides and then skip them in real time. So one of the things to learn is from your presentation tool, how can you skip slides during a presentation so that doesn't look clumsy to do that. That way you can go into the expansion joints if you need to, if somebody needs more context or needs more information about something, but leave those out as a normal course of event. This is also really useful if you have a fixed time slot and you're not quite sure how many questions you're going to get or how much detail you're going to be asked to go into for particular subject matters. Adding expansion joints in there means that you can add or subtract information if you need to so that you can fit more exactly into the time slot that you have. So those are all things about preparing a presentation. Let's talk about physically building the presentation. Now you'll also notice within this presentation, I have these section slides. This is a pattern that we call intermezzi. These are the intermezzos between the other slides. This helps the person who's watching the show keep the organization of the slide deck in their head. Because very early on I had an agenda slide that said we're going to prepare, and then build, and then deliver. This is the intermezzi slide that says we're now entering into the build part. So this is kind of a roadmap within the presentation. And the first one of these is an anti-pattern that we call the cookie cutter anti-pattern. And this is a trap that a lot of people fall into when they use presentation tools like Keynote or PowerPoint. The point here is that some ideas are greater than 1 slide's worth of volume. In fact, most ideas are greater than 1 slide's worth of volume. But it seems like people, when they use a tool like PowerPoint, think that slides are very expensive, and so they want to use as few slides as possible and cram as much material as possible onto singular slides. Stop doing that. Slides are free. They couldn't be more free. Stop compressing information onto them and open them up and make them a lot wider. Don't allow the tool to alter your message. Don't assume that every idea you have will fit on 1 slide, because that's not true. And this is a good example of why we wanted to call out anti-patterns in this space, because what happens in PowerPoint when you're typing along on a bullet-riddled corpse slide and you get to the end of the text box and hit enter, PowerPoint just shrinks everything and allows you to keep typing stuff. That's horrible. It's encouraging you to do some terrible, terrible thing. So never use auto-size text. It is evil because it's just going to encourage you to put more and more density on single slides. Let me show you what I mean by that, because what most people don't use in presentation software is the transition between slides. But if you have a consistent transition between slides, when you skip that transition, you can actually unify slides together. Here is another good example of a terrible slide deck. Way too much information density on this slide, and you'll notice that every time I flip to the next slide, I get what I call hard transitions. The entire slide gets replaced with a new set of text instantaneously. That's what we call a hard transition. You'll notice tons of other nasty anti-patterns on here too, but the hard transition thing is what I really want to call out here. Let me give you an example of a different way of managing transitions. So this is an example from one of my technical decks about doing a refactoring and using these soft transitions. So I start out with some code that looks like this, and I want to talk about extracting each one of these pieces one at a time. And so I'm doing animations to pull those things out, and then transitions to move between slides. And so here's an example. I'm talking about refactoring something and pulling it up into the object hierarchy, so I can use motion on the slide to show this moving up in the object hierarchy, for example. This is another example of something moving up in the object hierarchy. And this is a good example of being able to manipulate code and using animations and transitions for effects like that, splitting these two things into two different parts. The point of this is, how many slides did you just see? And more to the point, who cares how many slides were there? Because of the way that I'd set up the transitions, everything kind of moves step at a time from one piece to another, and you don't even realize that you're moving from one slide to the other. This lets the message dictate the flow. And so the idea here is that create consistent transitions and then violate those when you want to tie several things together. This is the idea of having soft transitions versus hard transitions. Now, that's a very overt example, but here's a softer version that works better for something like a corporate deck. So for example, maybe I have a slide here where I have some legitimate bullet points of things that I want to talk about, but this is not the end of the stuff I want to talk about from a making it stick standpoint. So the soft transition version here says, leave the title and the visual element in place, just replace the body of the slide with additional points that you want to make. So now you've basically just replaced the body. It's still about making it stick, and you still have the visual element there. And so you have either fixed elements or transitory elements. This is a more subtle version of soft transition, but this keeps the context of making it stick on the screen all the time without flipping between slides without needing to. So when you use no transitions in your slide deck, you're building an info deck, you're also forced into a very choppy narrative. Your narrative is now defined by the boundaries of the slides. When you use soft transitions, you use the transitions, the tool more intelligently, you get control of the narrative flow. So you can tell exactly how much time people should spend on one subject before they move to the next one. You don't have this artificial cadence of slide barriers going by over and over again. So we much prefer soft transitions to hard transitions. You know what else is soft? Zombies. This is the cake from one of our parties. This was a zombie party. We have a really, really good cake maker. Every single thing here is edible. The worms are gummy worms. The dirt is actually ground up Oreo cookies, and that's all fondant sugar. This is the cake that he made for us when it was buried treasure one year. Every single bit of that is also edible. The entire thing is a cake. It's brown sugar along the bottom, and the little seashells are made of sugar. So everything there except the tablecloth is edible there as well. So these are all examples of what we call temporal patterns that manipulate time in one way or another. So InfoDeck is a temporal pattern. I just talked about soft transitions and intermezzi slides. There's another pattern that you see exemplified right here called charred trail. The idea of charred trail is once you said something and move to the next thing, the previous item grays out so that you always know exactly what you're talking about. This allows you to create bulleted slides but still present them so that you just talk about one thing at a time. versus bringing the entire slide up at one time. We really don't like doing that because if you bring an entire slide up at one time with a bunch of text on it, every single person in the room will read the entire slide and then wait for you to slowly read it back to them. You definitely want to bring things out as they come up. And slidegement is another one of these temporal anti-patterns. And this is unfortunately way too common in the technical world and architects and tech leads and people like that. This is actually a definition from Presentation Zen. When you try to create a slideshow that also acts as a document, you create a slidegement. And we call slidegement an anti-pattern. This is where you create a deck that is meant to be passed around via email like an info deck, but also meant to be projected on a wall. You cannot make a good version of that deck because you either optimize it for presentation or you optimize it for being an info deck. It cannot be both at the same time. There are some things you can do to mitigate this somewhat though. Charred trail is one of those things. So here's an example of that charred trail pattern that as you move away from something it grays out. And so when you print this, it'll still look like a regular bulleted slide, but when you actually present it, you can present things one thing at a time so that you have a better exposition rate. That mitigates the slidegement business just a little bit. The other pattern that we have here is called exuberant title top, where the title starts in the middle of the slide and then moves up to the top of the slide. So in general, try to avoid creating slidegements as much as you possibly can. We actually recommend creating multiple versions of a presentation. There are two options here. One is do the proper presentation in the slide and then do extensive notes in the notes part of the presentation. And then when you print it to send it around to people to flip through, print the speaker notes as well as the slides. That allows you to have the textual content, but also something that's presentable as well. We've also gone as far as creating a slideshow and then another document in a proper word processor desktop publishing software as the two different versions of that intellectual property that we're putting out there. In general, slidegements are kind of creepy and we want to get away from them. You want to know what else is creepy? 2,000 cockroaches in a bathroom is creepy. I'm the proud owner of more than 2,000 rubber cockroaches. This is one of our bathrooms from our Halloween party, which has a few cockroaches taped to the wall. The cool thing about this bathroom was we also installed 2 strobe lights in the bathroom so that when you close the door, the strobe lights come on and all the cockroaches look like they're moving. It was awesome. Unfortunately, a lot of people were not able to use that bathroom. Another one of our patterns that we really like is this thing called a context keeper. This allows you to go on a digression and then come back and allow people to know where they still are within the context of the slideshow that you're doing. So let me give you an example of a good context keeper. And you'll notice that the litmus paper over here on the left basically follows around every slide. I'm using a feature in Keynote called Magic Move that does the move automatically for me. And while I'm talking about litmus tests, those litmus papers stay on the screen at all times. So now whoever is watching this can tell just by glancing at the screen, oh, we're still talking about litmus tests. That's a really good context keeper because it's holding the context of the thing we're talking about on the screen at all times. Another similar technique is one that we call backtracking. Backtracking is where you purposefully duplicate a slide and put it in later because you're doing a digression and you want to come back to a point. In fact, astute observers will notice that I did that earlier in this presentation when I was talking about forethought. I went to the forethought slide, then I showed a mind map, then I came back to the forethought slide and then continued building it. This is backtracking. This is physically making a copy of a partial slide and pasting it so that you can continue building that slide later, but this is also a great way to keep a context alive. So another really common occurrence when you're talking about technical presentations are demonstrations versus presentations. And where this really plays out for us as developers and architects are live demos versus what we call dead demos. That's our anti-pattern. And the way this is manifest for technical people is doing presentations where you do live coding. Most of the time, live coding is primarily about ego gratification, not about showing you how to do something in the most concise way possible. So Live coding does work well in some places. For example, if you're doing a tutorial or something like that, a live coding works well because you want people to see every single moving part. It doesn't work well if you're doing a detailed technical deep dive. Any time where you have to do a lot of typing to set up something before you can start showing something interesting, you're just wasting time with doing all that setup. I'll show an alternative to that in just a second. Product demos work well for things like live coding and live demos, whereas if you have a lot of tool interaction or tools that take a long time to start up before you can interacting with them, that's not a good thing to do live coding with. And obviously hands-on classes work really, really well with live coding. But any time-consuming task does not work well in a live coding kind of scenario. You can actually get by and do a lot of really clever things without showing code in an integrated development environment. Your first instinct is to show code in an IDE because that's where you see it every day. But you actually have some advantages if you copy and paste code out of the IDE and put it on a slide. For example, this is a technique that we call traveling highlights. What I did was go into an IDE, capture a screenshot of the code, then I highlighted the code that I was interested in and captured the exact same region, and then put the first one on the slide and then animated the second one in on top of it, and when they're lined up exactly right, just the highlighted part grows around that code. So that's one version of a pattern that we call traveling highlights. Here's another version of it when I want to call out specific details about each thing. Each of these are just screenshots where I've highlighted a different thing and I'm just fading that in on top of the existing picture. So I can talk about these things one at a time as the slide reminds me of what I want to talk about. Here's another example of this. This is a more subtle version of that. So here's traveling highlights. I mentioned that one before, so it kind of fades in. A more subtle version of this is what we call opacity shift, where you actually make everything around the code you want to highlight, make it dimmer so that it kind of fades into the background. But the trick on this one is you have to make sure the projector you're using has really good contrast, because if it doesn't, you can't tell that the contrast has changed at all. This is the opacity shift temporal pattern. And here's another good example. You can manipulate things because you're in a presentation tool in ways that you could not if you're in an IDE. So in one of my presentations, I wanted to make the point that there's a lot of duplicated code between these two little methods. And what better way to illustrate that than just overlaying them on top of one another so you can see exactly what's duplicated and what's not. And so that's another example of manipulating code within a slide versus an IDE. The other pattern that we use here very frequently, and this is a really key pattern for doing presentations where you're interacting with complicated things, this is what we call the lip sync pattern. So you'll notice I have no laptop anywhere around me. What I've done is recorded this interaction with this tool back in my hotel room where I knew that it was going to work. Murphy's Law always kicks in if you're trying to do a live presentation in front of a group of people. All you're doing is adding extra stress to yourself to ensure that something will work perfectly live. Why not capture it in video, paste that on a slide? Now, as I'm talking about this, I can talk about it. I don't have to interact with the tools. I can talk over the top of it. I don't have to think about what's going on here. And I absolutely know that this demo is going to work because when I recorded this video, it worked perfectly. This is a pattern that we call the lip sync pattern. And you can also use this to cut out extraneous junk. Matthew McCullough, one of my co-authors, used this lip sync pattern. He was doing this really elaborate debugging presentation and a lot of tool interaction, and he ended up going from one demo lasting 19 minutes and 30 seconds down to 1 minute and 30 seconds because what he did was use lip sync and sped up the video for the server starting up and all this interaction that the audience didn't really care anything about. It had to be up and running to be working, but they didn't want to sit through all that stuff booting up, and so he just sped the video up so all of that stuff happened in 15 seconds versus 15 minutes, and that allowed him to get another 20 minutes worth of material in his presentation. So temporal patterns allow you typically to get a higher information density within your presentation by cutting out stuff that shouldn't be there to begin with. You will notice occasionally in this presentation that things go to black. This is a really good placeholder. If you go to public speaking courses like Toastmaster or SpeakRite, there are various schools that talk about doing public speaking. One of the things they will tell you is don't use slides because now people don't look at you, they look at your slides. I think that's not correct because slides are a very useful way to show things. But what you can do is purposefully insert a blank slide. Then the audience has to look back at you because you're the only thing interesting in the front of the room anymore. So when you want to pull the focus back to you, put a blank slide in place and it looks almost like you've turned the projector off. This is a pattern that we call invisibility. The other thing that we like to do is get rid of stale content. So if it's not needed on the screen anymore, get rid of it and move to a blank slide and talk about something so that you don't have old information on the slide behind you. And finally, just a few tips on actually delivering your presentation. One of the anti-patterns you have to watch out for is an anti-pattern that we call hiccup words. It's very common when you're doing public speaking to pick up little terms, either ums or ahs, or little phrases you use like, or I know a really well-known speaker whose hiccup word is he ends every sentence with right. And he doesn't realize that he's doing this, but pretty much every sentence he ends with a right question. This is one of the critical things you have to do to get better as a public speaker. Video yourself speaking and watch it because you don't realize you're saying those hiccup words, but once you see yourself on tape doing it, it sticks out like a sore thumb. That is the best way to chase away those little odd verbal tics you have, is to watch yourself doing them so that you can think about it and pay attention to it later. Another anti-pattern we call out during the presentation is what we call going meta. Don't talk about the slideshow that you're about to do. A common anti-pattern is to come in and say, oh man, I was up until 3 a.m. working on this slide deck. I hope it doesn't suck. Well, everybody's going to be looking for it to suck because you've already planted that in their head. I was at a conference in Europe and a really well-known speaker got up on stage and he said, the very first thing he said was, oh, I'm really sorry, this presentation is normally scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes, but I only have an hour, so I'm going to hurry. And he ended up finishing in 55 minutes, and he did the entire presentation because he didn't anticipate how little interaction he was going to get. So even though he did the entire presentation and had time left over, the audience felt cheated because he set them up to feel cheated by saying, oh, I'm going to rush through it. If he hadn't said anything, they would have been perfectly happy with his presentation. So don't talk about your presentation as part of your presentation. There's no upside to that, and there's just lots of downsides to it. Another pattern that we have in this world is what we call the crucible pattern, and this is an idea of never stop improving. What this crucible pattern suggests is very often architects, technical people end up spinning up one-off decks. They'll present it one time and then it'll go into the scrap heap and they'll build another one sometime later. If you can avoid doing that, try to build one deck and then start revising it. This was the advice that I gave in the writing section, is to start revising things. But what happens when you give technical presentations, every single time you give that presentation, you'll think of improvements that you can make to that presentation. Make those improvements, because the more improvements you make, the more likely it is that people are going to like it and want you to do that presentation more than one time. So the crucible pattern says never stop improving it, keep trying to make that presentation better and better, and you will find more opportunities to reuse that material. So to summarize this, presentations are an integral part of an architect's job at most companies, and most communication from a technical standpoint happens with tools like PowerPoint and Keynote. But you were never taught how to use PowerPoint and Keynote, and the default use of those tools is not particularly good. And so that's why we came up with this idea of patterns and anti-patterns to help hopefully improve that. So the last point of this is, if you have a presentation that was thrown together at 3 a.m. and has spelling mistakes and grammatical errors and mistyped code copied and pasted into it, versus someone who spent some time and built an actual presentation with a narrative arc and has nice transitions and animations, Whose idea do you think is more likely to be adopted by the company? The one that shows a little bit initiative and preparation, or the one that was clearly slapped together? This is a way to make your ideas really shine in an organization, and something that you should not neglect. This is a really important aspect of being an architect, is be able to communicate ideas effectively.